When we last left off, we had covered the great religious traditions that were born in the classical period, and a couple that were born in the pre-classical period, like Judaism and Hinduism, those Vedic religions. And then within the classical period, we've got the evolution of Christianity, and we talked about in China, Confucianism and Taoism. We talked about a little bit more about Hinduism. We talked about the evolution of Buddhism. This map that you want to look at here is going to show that both Buddhism and Christianity are going to do a lot of spreading over time. All right? And here's one important difference between the religions that we talked about the other day. Judaism. It is absolutely a monotheistic religion, but the Jewish people consider themselves to be God's chosen people, okay? And as such, individuals can't just, on a whim, become God's chosen people, because who does the choosing there? It's God, right? One second, sir. So over the course of the last, 3,000 years, the Jewish population in the world has remained relatively small. Despite it being one of the oldest religions that's still practiced today, the global population of Jews is relatively small. Compare that to something like Christianity that opened its doors for everybody. There's no racial requirement for Christianity. There's no there's no income requirement absolutely for Christianity. Everybody is welcome into Christianity. And Christianity attempts to spread and attempts to bring people into the fold. So Christianity, starting, centuries after Judaism was born, Christianity is quickly going to grow larger than Judaism, and then to today being by far the largest faith in the world with over 2 billion practitioners. We're going to have a lot of movement of Christianity. We're going to have a lot of missionary activity. People going out with their goal to bring more people into the flock. And Buddhism is very much the same way. Buddhism is going to experience strong missionary activity. First, sponsored by that Mauryan Emperor Ashoka that we talked about the other day. Ashoka will fund and allow for Buddhist missionaries to leave the Indian subcontinent and spread the ideas of Buddhism. And we're going to see a great spread from the Indian subcontinent here into China and into Southeast Asia. And now this only goes to a certain extent. We're going to see Buddhism spread even further over more time. But please know that Christianity and Buddhism are two religions that encourage missionary activity, encourage people to head out and spread that faith, okay? Judaism doesn't do it. Hinduism really doesn't do it. We see limited exchange or movement of Hinduism. That's mostly going to come through trade connections, not necessarily missionary activity. Yes, ma'am?
I thought Judaism was the second most popular religion in the world.
Nope. It's by far. Judaism is a hugely influential religion, first and foremost, because without Judaism first, there is no Christianity, there is no Islam afterwards. Hugely influential. And then because of the diaspora, it might seem bigger than it is, but because...
Half my family is Jewish, so that's probably where I got it.
Well, just because half your family is doesn't mean half my family is or half of anybody else's family is. So it's a big deal. The world does not revolve around you. No, it seems maybe like more influential. It's certainly more influential than their population would denote, and that's maybe in part because of that diaspora going back to 70 CE when the Romans caused the evacuation of the Jews from their homeland, and Jews spread out around the world. So they're small populations, but you do have Jewish populations throughout Europe and in North Africa, throughout the Middle East formerly, although that's going to change a lot in the last half century because of the Arab-Israeli issues. And then throughout, of course, the United States. From the founding of the United States, there was a small Jewish population in the United States. And by the late 1800s, as persecution of Jews, especially persecution of Jews in Russia, where that had the largest population of Jews in the world at the time, as that persecution of Jews is going to rise, many more Jewish people will migrate out of Eastern Europe, and most of them coming to the United States, coming further west. So we have a sizable Jewish population in the United States, but it's not that big. I think at last I checked, I think about 6% of Americans, of 6% total are Jewish. I think there's about 70% of Americans identify themselves with Christianity. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, and I think Islam is just surpassing right now Judaism in the United States as a population. But that's another thing that's skewed in our minds. Because we live in the Detroit area and we have the largest Arab population in the world in the Detroit area outside of the Middle East. The largest Arab population outside of the Middle East is in the Detroit area. Did I just blow your mind there? Yeah, okay. If you were to go to Dearborn, Michigan, if you go to Dearborn, guys, please, quiet. Dearborn is the home of Ford Motor Company, right? And there's no coincidences here. Dearborn, Michigan is the home, specifically, it's the one community that is home to most of the Arab Americans in the Detroit area. And it's, like I said, the largest Arab community outside of the Middle East. Why? It goes back decades. It's not a new thing. It goes back to when the auto companies were recruiting workers from around the world to come into the Americas. So we have a skewed version, and I'm going to get to you. We have a skewed view of what the population of Arabs are in our community. Because if all you know is the Detroit area, you would think that there are far more people from the Middle East living in the United States than there really are. People that live in Kansas, people that live in Nebraska, people that live in Kentucky, they don't run into nearly as many people from the Middle East as we do here in the Detroit area, just because of migration patterns. And by the same token, you guys would probably say, well, there's not that many Latin American people living in the United States, because there's not that many, not that large of a population around us. But if you were to spend some time in Southern California or anywhere in the southern portion of the United States, your view would certainly be skewed. You had a question, Alex.
Yeah, so I was talking about like how the Jewish religion, like
Yeah.
problem, like well not problem, but one unique thing about it is that it can't spread like. What I mean by spreading is like converting new people.
Yeah.
Because they don't do any missionary work at all because their religion says that they are chosen people.
Yeah, so there's no missionary activity, and to become Jewish is much more difficult than it would be, say, to become a Christian or to become a Muslim. Traditionally, one becomes Jewish because their mom is Jewish. And that's kind of an interesting, we call Judaism a matrilineal descent line, where the faith is passed on through the mother. So if an individual has a mother who happens to be Jewish and a father who is a Gentile and not a Jew, the child will technically be Jewish. If it went the other way, the child would technically not, and would have to go through some conversion process. But that's beyond the point. The point is, these two faiths, Buddhism and Christianity, both encourage missionary activity, so they're both going to experience a great spread, and they're both going to experience a great population growth. Yes?
So, I'm just wondering about the Christian religion. When you're born, does it mean that if your mom or dad is a Christian, does it mean directly that you are a Christian? Or?
Technically, there's no, see, Judaism is at once an ethnicity and a religion at the same time, all right? That's why when we use the phrase, if I can get everybody's ears on me, when we use the phrase anti-Semitism for that anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitism refers to an ethnic group of people. Semitic people are, it's an ethnic group born in the Middle East, right? Arabs are actually Semitic people as well. They're from the same ethnic line, right? But we specifically use anti-Semitic, that word anti-Semite, as someone who is racist against Jewish people. So Judaism at the same time is a religion, yes, but it's also an ethnicity. It's like a race of people. Which is why you get, in a lot of cases, you have people that are devout and practicing Jews who are obviously ethnically Jewish, but then you have people that are ethnically Jewish, and they would call themselves Jewish, but they're secular. We know that word, secular? Yes, ma'am? Very good. Where if you're secular, you're not practicing. Can someone grab the door? It's just a little loud out there. It's separate from religion. We go to a secular school. So I'm allowed to talk about all these religions. I just can't tell you which one is correct if I had an opinion. Okay? We are a secular school. Religious schools, of course, they're not secular. So Judaism is at once both an ethnicity and a religion. Christianity doesn't care about your ethnic background. And that's why you could go to every continent on the planet and find Christians who have very little like racial or ethnic connection with each other, but would share the same religion. It's what we would call a universal religion. Anybody can come into the fold. Same thing with Islam. You can go to every continent on Earth, maybe even Antarctica, depending on who's doing research there right now and what kind of teams are put together, and find Muslims all around the world. Yes. And the same thing with Buddhism. There's no ethnic requirement within Buddhism. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask about why Hinduism didn't spread, for example.
Why doesn't Hinduism spread? It does. Okay, so there are three reasons that we're going to kind of harken back to as we go through this year that ideas will spread around the world. Okay, generally throughout world history, three ways things move. All right. Ideas move. Ideas from like religion to technology to, the way we run our society. And those three ways, a couple of them we've talked about, missionary activity, like people going from point A to point B to spread their faith. And of course, when people are going from point A to point B to spread their faith, do you think they ever take anything else with them? Yeah. They'll take a lot of cultural ideas and maybe sometimes even technology from their original home. So you've got missionary activity, missionaries. You've got probably the biggest one through world history, merchants, missionaries, merchants, people that are moving around the world to sell stuff, to make money. And of course, when they sell, they take other things with them. Sometimes the merchants take the faith with them, right? Sometimes the merchants, through their sales, are taking new technologies and new ideas with them. Right? So missionary activity, merchants. Anyone want to take a guess at the third one? It's another M. That's going to allow for the spreading of culture and ideas and technology and traditions. Military, merchants, and, yeah? Migration? I think migration kind of works in it all. I screwed it up and I gave you the answer. That's not cool, Dobie. Missionary activity, merchants, and military. You guys are absolutely correct. So when armies move, they take ideas with them. When armies conquer lands, they take ideas from their homes and bring them to new places. So those are reasons that ideas spread. Specifically for religions, we see a lot of idea spread through missionary activity, particularly in Christianity and Buddhism. But merchant activity is going to take it as well. If you are a Christian merchant, you might tell people about your faith as you travel and trade. All right? Hinduism spreads from the Indian subcontinent south, and in some cases into what is today Indonesia, through a lot of merchant activity itself. Also, when we're thinking about Buddhism and Christianity together, we also want to point out that they both encourage monastic life. Monastic life. I'll write that on the board here. Yeah, not the molasses life. That sounds too sticky. Monastic life. Monastic life is encouraging monks within your faith. Christian monks or Buddhist monks, we kind of mentioned them the other day. These are people, typically men, but Tyler, you mentioned the other day that there are women, nuns you still call them, and in the Christian world, or at least in the Catholic world, there are nuns. People that separate themselves from the society to live a more pure and connected life with the faith. All right? Yes, sir.
That's why in Buddhism, most of the monks are bald, so they cannot really tell which one is a female
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and that is to avoid them from being like considered attractive to others, so they can. Like,
Because
devote
getting rid of desire, human desire, is the way to nirvana, right? Awesome. Thank you for that. I've never heard that before. Alex, I'm sorry. You had something about a year and a half ago you wanted to say.
I think I already said that.
Okay. No, go ahead. So we're all good? Okay. Yes, I got one over here, and then Emily.
Like monastic be another like M for like that spread religion.
Yeah, it can, because sometimes monasteries, so a monk is the individual who lives in a monastery, and they're all like practicing the monastic movement, okay? So these words are all tied together. So yeah, it can spread, if you build a monastery in a place where Christianity hasn't already taken firm hold, well then the monastery might be, and this is one point of them, could be an example to the community as to how to live a Christian life. Because those people are really living the Christian life, or the Buddhist life, or what have you. The reason, though, that AP brings this up, and if you notice the section in our standards, it's about how belief systems are impacting gender roles. So when we talk about missionary activity or a monastic movement within Christianity, for example, who do you think is becoming missionaries? Who do you think are more likely becoming the monks? Men. So men who would have in maybe previous days stayed closer to the family and the community, men are removing themselves, withdrawing themselves. And there's going to be some impact on gender relations in these Christian societies as the men are more likely to leave. This will be, just to put a little bit of an earworm that you can maybe remember a few months down the road when we get to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, and don't write this down, you're going to get it much later in the year. Martin Luther, one of his beefs with the Roman Catholic Church is this encouragement of the monastic lifestyle, because it takes men away from their families. So he's going to have 95 of these complaints against the Roman Catholic Church, but one of them is this encouragement of men withdrawing from their families, men withdrawing from their communities. Yes, ma'am?
He cheated on his wife like crazy though, so it's kind of.
We'll talk more about him as we get later into the year. Let's not beat up on people's religious founders yet. All right. To continue to talk about gender roles in society, I want to go back to this when we discussed the relationships of Confucius, right? Confucius sets up a hierarchical system in society that would, if orchestrated correctly, would lead to order both within the government and society and within the household. And so we notice that there is this important relationship. It's the second one, so the second most important relationship for Confucius, between the father and the son. All right? This is what's known in Confucianism as filial piety. You read more about that in just a little bit. Filial piety. F-I-L-I-A-L. Filial piety. P-I-E-T-Y. Filial piety. It is on your standards. And this means specifically, yes, Hannah?
I was going to ask if it only applies to boys or if it applies to mothers.
It's okay. What do we learn about a Confucius system by looking at the relationships that Confucius taught about? Farah?
If you're older and a man, you probably want to be a leader.
Older males probably are running the show. Tyler?
It's more of a paternal system.
Very good. And then let me throw, rather than a paternal system, let me throw a patriarchal system. Okay? A lot of the words that we use are based on the Greek language, right? Patriarchal. You guys have seen the word monarchy before. Monarchy. We talked the other day about Confucius setting up a hierarchical system where there's like ranking in society, right? The Greek philosophers, some of them were writing about how society should be organized and whether they should be hierarchical in nature, for example. This root comes from a Greek word meaning to rule. Okay, so like a monarchy is a rule by one. You guys are familiar with this. So a patriarchy
is a society that is dominated by the males of society. All right? There could be a matriarchy, but there really aren't a lot in the world. There are some societies that are more matriarchal than others, but there really aren't societies that are dominated by women until like the Utica Academy for International Studies. Except for our current freshman class that seems to be tipping the balance a little bit. No, this is, if you want to like feel,
Man, why do all these other older times in history have such big events and we just have to live in our own boring time? No. You guys are absolutely living in a time of history that maybe a couple centuries down the road is going to be one of those revolutionary times that people will talk about, much like the Neolithic Revolution, in that we are living in a society and in a time that is like the first in human history where women and men are generally seeing equality. The opportunities that women have are generally, and I'm not going to get into feminist debates yet, okay? Or certainly we're not going to record these. We might get there as we press on in the year. But we do it every year in this school. We have young men that get admitted to some of the greatest colleges in the world, and we have young women that get admitted to some of the greatest colleges in the world. And as you guys go on to school and you guys become successful in your careers, American society is starting to see young women have opportunities to be like breadwinners and primary breadwinners in many cases. More young women in America today are going off to colleges and universities, giving them opportunities to have higher paying jobs maybe than the men in their society. So we're going through a dramatic shift in our society, and our society is not really any different from like Western European society, and now this is spreading to Asian societies where the patriarchy that has existed since civilization has existed is starting to come to an end, it seems. All right? It has absolutely ended in my house, as I have to stop at the grocery store on the way home to make sure I have something to cook for dinner for my lovely wife. All right? And then I will ask her if it's okay if maybe on Sunday, just for a little bit, not the whole time, if I maybe can get together with my friends for a little bit to watch a little bit of football. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. All right? I'll take care of all my chores before I would go. All right? No? I have to watch the game from home? Okay. No problem. Guys, you are entering this world. Get ready for it, all right? It ain't what it used to be. What do the relationships that Confucius draws up, what does this tell us about the society that Confucius is creating? It is a strict patriarchy. He does not say mother to child. He does not say father to daughter, all right? This is the important relationship for Confucius. And unfortunately for Chinese women, it is going to establish a patriarchal system that's going to last up until today. Yes?
Also in the Asian culture of Confucius, even up to now, the male of the family, like for the son, between the son or the daughter, the son is usually seen as a person who would fulfill the duties
Absolutely.
towards the family.
Absolutely.
While the woman is not.
And this has some pretty stark impact on China, for example, because China created its own sociologic experiment back in the early 1980s to try to stem their population growth. The government of China instituted the one-child policy, which you might be familiar with, and this basically dictated by law that families can only have one child. But in a strict patriarchal society, if you can only have one child, you would much rather have a male, because according to this society and according to notions of filial piety, it is that child's responsibility in the elderly years of the adult to take care of them. Okay? Not put them in nursing homes and things like that and forget about them, as we tend to do in Western culture. But to take, it's the child, so it's your son that in your old age will look out for you. But if you can only have one child and you have a daughter, what traditionally happens, starting to change these days, but what traditionally happens to the daughter in one of these societies? Mina?
She gets married.
Shh, very good. She gets married and she goes to live with her husband. Her husband will one day take care of his parents. Who's left to take care of her parents? the state, maybe, in modern times. So this one-child policy has had some pretty serious impact about how people treat it. Issues of sex-selected abortions, which are technically illegal in China, but it absolutely happens. Even some issues of infanticide, where people have unfortunately killed their babies because they weren't of the correct gender, have occurred in China. I'm going to go back, starting in the back, come around, and then we're going to press on. Jay.
I heard not too long ago that since like that happened, now like all the people there like there's so many males and not enough females.
There is an imbalance between males and females in China that is unnatural. Absolutely. Yep. We're going to say the same thing?
Yeah, they're starting to like traffic girls now. Like I think in the South they are like selling girls to like anymore.
So this, in economics, you guys might have heard last year some talk about the law of unintended consequences. Sometimes things happen, like we have, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, Robert Burns said. But sometimes you don't plan on things happening when you make big, dramatic changes to social policy. Yes, Alex?
I was going to bring up that it has. They've since repealed that.
The government has realized this is not sustainable. Absolutely.
Yeah, they've repealed that. However, they're coming up with something because it is a real problem. If
Absolutely.
you think about it, like they had to find a way to solve it. That was the first solution they came up with, but it didn't really quite work out. But I think you kind of have to understand like the reason why they had to do it.
Oh, no doubt. What China is realizing now is kind of the same thing that the United States and Western Europe and Japan have realized. What lowers birth rates? Economic success. When countries grow economically, birth rates decline. When our children, when we start treating children rather than like laborers like we have in traditional agricultural society, but like sweet, adorable little things that we want to spoil, and spoiling kids costs money, and we want to send our kids to universities, and that costs money, and we start to freak out when I think about, oh my gosh, if we have another kid, how much more is that going to change our life? And we're all indulgent and self-obsessed, where if I have another kid, that's even less stuff that I get to do that I like to do. So wealthy societies tend to have far fewer children, and we're seeing that Japan is going through a dramatic demographic change. The word demography?
People.
Study of people and populations. Very good. Japan is going through a pretty dramatic demographic change because they are having too few children. Most people in Japan aren't having enough kids, and that means when a birth rate of a society falls below 2.1, that's a really tiny kid. A birth rate is how many children every woman is going to have. Women in a society have to have slightly more than 2 kids per woman to have a population be maintaining itself. That means like replace mom and dad eventually. It's got to be slightly more than 2 because of what?
Because they'll just stay stagnant.
No. Yes, ma'am?
There's actually something like this going on in South Korea right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Where, people are having children later, like in their 30s and 40s, and scientists predict that South Korea's population will be extinct in the next 200 to 300 years.
Wow, extinct? Well, that might be a little extreme. Scientists predict a lot of things that don't come to fruition, but I bet people will move into all those nice houses eventually. But we have to have slightly more than 2 children per woman because some kids don't make it. Some kids die at childbirth, some kids die in infancy. Obviously, the wealthier the society, those tend to have far lower infant mortality rates. But when societies fall under that 2 threshold, their population over time will decline. It's just math. There's no way to avoid it. Western Europe is going through it. Eastern Europe is really going through it. Italy is really going through it. Russia is really going through it. The United States would be going through it, except we allow so much immigration into our country that immigrants tend to have larger families, and they're what's keeping our population still growing rather than being in decline itself. And every society in human history that has gone through population decline has collapsed. Every civilization has collapsed. So this is definitely a concern that people look at. Yes, ma'am?
You know what
It's slightly over 2.
So it's like we're barely making.
But that is skewed by non-native parents. Immigrant parents tend to have more children than non-immigrant parents. So the birth rate of native-born American women is under 2, slightly under 2. Yes, ma'am.
Could it also be like the reason that's like slightly over 2 is because like some people choose not to have kids, so you have to replace those
Yep.
people who don't have kids too?
Yeah, but we're talking about society as a whole. So if on average, so that already factors in the fact that some families right now have 5 kids and some have 0 kids. Yeah.
Google says that America's birth rate is 1.88.
1.8, so it is under 2. What? That's different from that's in 2012. I wonder if it's even lower now. Wow.
It's has a normal.
So it's not falling, not falling. So that does not bode well. Good thing. And why do we have an immigration? Why don't we have like solid walls around our nation like some politicians would want that don't allow people in? Because we do embrace immigration in the United States because we need it. Yes.
Talking about right now is so contrary to everything that I've heard about population growth, because like people are so afraid that we're gonna like outgrow the earth and there's gonna be no resources left for us. But in reality, we have to maintain growth or we die out.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird problem there. First thing, there are concerns about global population, but these concerns were bigger back in like the 1970s and 80s. There was a guy named Paul Ehrlich. You don't need to know his name. He wrote a book called The Population Boom, I believe, in the late 60s, saying as these population growth rates around the world continue, we are quickly going to be in crisis mode. There's not going to be enough food to feed people. There's not going to be enough resources. Paul Ehrlich didn't completely take into account human ingenuity, and he didn't completely take into account that birth rates would naturally fall as human societies became wealthier. So, like, for example, China and India they're night and day different countries than they were back in the 1970s, and their birth rates on their own are falling. We're also seeing dramatic birth rate declines in African nations as well right now. And then there's some other things that are changing populations, especially in Africa, like diseases like AIDS has ravaged the population of sub-Saharan Africa. Today we drive more miles than we've ever driven before, but we're using less oil than we've ever used before because the cars that we drive are so much more fuel efficient than they've ever been. So we grow more food per acre than human beings have ever grown before. So we grow far more on far less land. So it's not, I'm not as big of a doom and gloomer. There was a guy that wrote back in the 1700s, his name was Thomas Malthus. He was the original guy that said, populations are becoming too big and we can't feed everybody and it's all going to be war and chaos. And he wrote this in the 18th century. And according to Malthus's calculations, we should already have destroyed our societies, our civilization. But we keep on coming up with new ways to handle stuff. I'm more of an optimist on things like that. You might not be. I am.
I don't really. Everything I've ever heard about population growth is different.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it makes sense.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Your hand is up.
I thought you were just saying yeah to her.
Yeah, no, I don't know everybody's name yet.
Actually, Hannah looked it up on her phone and it says the birth rate is 3.98.
Where?
USA today.
That's a lot of.
There might be some, yeah. Like, how many of you know people that have families with 4 kids? I know you do. Okay, wait, that's, because you all know, never mind, that's a bad question. How many of you are in a family with 4 or more children? How many of you are in a family with 3 children? 2 children? 1 child? How many of you are in families that have no kid? All right. All right, we need to press on, guys, or we're never going to get through any of this. These are, of course, the religions that we talked about, the traditions that we talked about are not the only traditions. We'll talk about him in a second. These religions that we've talked about are not, of course, the only traditions. We want to avoid, we have long talked in AP World classes, or in AP classes in general, to beware Everybody beware the absolutes. We don't work in absolutes in AP World. We don't work in absolutes in human society. That means we're going to avoid words like all or every or any absolutist word, or no or never, because we're human beings. There's over 7 billion of us. There are always exceptions to the rule, right? So we want to avoid absolute. Despite the growth of these traditional religions, that many of them are going to grow to today into the billions of members, or at least hundreds of millions, there are still traditional religions, as there have been for thousands of years. I'm going to attach a couple words for you, like shamanism. Shamanism. Yes, ma'am?
That was in our summer notes.
One second.
Wasn't the, like, you like talk to spirits and stuff like that?
Very good.
I got that from Brother Bear.
All right, so in these traditional, you see this in Native American cultures, you see shamanist religions in like traditional African societies, where there might be spirits in nature around you, and there might be an individual in your society that can connect and converse with those spirits. So those are shamanistic faiths, still exist to this day despite the growth of these classical religions. Yes?
Can I just read what I have for it? So I can
Sure, if you'd like to.
So over shaman, it was in our summer homework under the
Yep.
very column. So a person who is believed to have special access to supernatural powers and the gods, and that they can use this power to their benefit or harm their community and or individuals. They aren't political figures, but can become very influential figures in tribes and nomadic communities.
Right.
Shamanism applies to Mongols and other indigenous tribal civilizations in Central Asia.
Absolutely.
Or,
Absolutely. And then we also see animist cultures or animist religions that still exist, where similar in nature to the notions of shamanism, but where spirits are seen in the natural world around you, including animals and including, plant life and things like this. You see a lot of this also in sub-Saharan African cultures. Many societies as well also practice ancestor veneration. Like, to venerate means to worship your ancestors. So your ancestors, your grandparents die, your family still stays connected to their spirits in the afterlife. And a lot of times we see, I want to give you this word that you should be familiar with. Syncretism. We see a root there syncing up, like things joining each other. In world history, in AP World History, we talk a lot about syncretism in that as there is missionary activity or merchant activity or military activity, and as societies and cultures and traditions spread throughout the world, sometimes they come in contact with other societies and cultures. Sometimes it gives a wholesale change to that society. Like Western Europe or East Asia, for example, is starting to look a lot more like the United States than it ever has before, right? So sometimes the society change. Sometimes the societies change, but still hold on to a lot of their traditional values. And so we see a syncretic relationship between them, where you might have a new religion enter the fold, like Buddhism, while ancestor veneration will persist. Yes, Tyler?
This is exactly what it was in Vietnam. Even though we were influenced by Buddhism a lot, and most of our tradition comes from Buddhists, but if somebody was to ask on paper and legal document to myself and my mom and dad, if you're Buddhist or not, we would write no. We would say we're ancestral veneration.
Oh, really?
Because most of our people who are with the Buddhist fold, where they're not necessarily like 100% Buddhist compared to other countries like Thailand, where there's a very strong, firm Buddhist, we tend to worship in the Southeast Asian region to our ancestor more. So there are some Buddhist connection, but then we would personally I would classify myself as ancestral venerators.
Interesting. Any other questions, comments on this? This is confusing for an American. Because as an American, what are we told? Do what you want. Does it matter who your dad is? No. No, you can be anything that your family connection, it means nothing. If your forefathers were horrible people and did horrible things, that has no impact whatsoever on you and how you will be, right? We are almost like the opposite of ancestor veneration. Many Americans are into ancestor forgetting about and moving on, right? And it doesn't impact and moving away from our families and not being that connected. But we'll talk much more about that as we go forward. Hannah, Alex, then done.
I'm sorry, I just had a hard time picking up on what syncretism actually was.
So syncretism is just like you will sync your iPhone to your computer, and that is like taking things that are on your iPhone and putting those pictures onto your computer, and your computer is going to have the original photos that you have long had on there, but now it's bringing these new things in there, creating a brand new photo album. Syncretism is when ideas and cultures move to new places, the new place will hold on to some traditional beliefs like ancestor veneration, but they will adopt new ideas like Buddhism, and creating a whole new culture that never existed before.
So it mixes with the ninja.
Very good.
culture.
Very good. Excellent, excellent, excellent. The last thing we're going to touch on is that last standard. I believe I got it as 215, although I didn't put it on my notes here. That these classical societies are going to express themselves not just through their faith, but often through art and architecture, and in many cases the written word. And for here we could talk about any of these societies. AP requires us to talk about one, so I'm going to pick out Greece because that seems to be what kids are most interested in. So here we look at a painting of a guy named Oedipus. All right, and this is based on a story, a play that we still have to this day called. Actually, it's a trilogy of Oedipus' story, written by a Greek playwright named Sophocles. And the story of Oedipus is about this little boy. And he is born to a king and a queen. And traditional in Greek culture, when you have a kid, especially if you're really important, like the king and the queen are, you go to the oracle and you say, "Hey, oracle, tell me about my kid. What's he going to be doing in life?" And the oracle says some bad news to Oedipus' parents. Anybody know what the oracle says? This is like spoiler alert for the whole book. Yes?
I think he'll kill his father and he'll marry his mother.
Oracle says, your little bouncing baby boy is one day going to kill you, king. And mom, he's going to marry you. And everybody now has the heebie-jeebies, right? All right. And here we go again, too, guys. Connections over time. I love studying world history because we realize that we're not all that different. If you got the heebie-jeebies about hearing about this little boy marrying his mom, so did people in ancient Greece, because this wouldn't have been a hit story if that wasn't something that would give people the heebie-jeebies. And I will show you, or I'll tell you in just a couple moments, how heebie-jeebie giving this story actually is. So Oedipus is told by his parents are told he's going to kill dad and he's going to marry his mom. Okay, I'm sorry if any of you want to go home and read this, because this is totally spoiler alert, okay? So plug your ears if you'd like to read it fresh on your own. What's that?
I did it last year from government.
Oh, you did? Okay, interesting. So some of you have already heard this.
I don't remember.
So anyway, so of course, if you are told by an oracle that your kid is going to kill dad and marry mom, that's a problem, and that's not a kid you want to hang around. So they did what any rational parents would do. They take a giant pin and jab it between his ankles and throw him out into onto a cliff. No, not like through your feet. So Oedipus is thrown away, basically. They probably should have just killed him outright. Because you know how this always works out in the movies. If you don't take care of it at first. But the prophecy's got to work out, so you can't mess with it. So, of course, as these things always happen, of course, some farmer happens to be wandering by and he's like, what? There's totally a kid there, and he doesn't look well. Someone bound his feet together. This is not good. The farmer takes in this little baby. He mends his feet, but he names him Swollen Foot. All right? So Oedipus is Greek for swollen feet. Okay, hey, some of you guys have wacky names too. So he raises this boy, and Oedipus obviously starting off with a really rough story, probably rougher than any of you could come up.
did any of you get abandoned by your parents at a young age and have your feet bound together and thrown to the woods? No. Yeah, maybe you don't know. So Oedipus grows up as a pretty tough and pretty strong-minded young man. Many, many years pass. What's that? No, he has no clue. He has no clue. They ditched him. So one day, Oedipus is making his way to town of Thebes. Guys, please. He's making his way. Yeah, I only have one chance to record this, guys. He's making his way to the town of Thebes, and Oedipus, along the way, sees like a caravan, a procession coming up towards him, and Oedipus, being strong-willed, because who wouldn't be strong-willed if you were like left to die as a little baby? Oedipus, being strong-willed, doesn't want to move aside as this procession comes. Well, it turns out this procession is like the king, right? And Oedipus is like, I'm not moving for you. You don't know me, kind of thing. And the king's like, move, and Oedipus is like, no. And a scuffle breaks out, and Oedipus slays the dude. He has no idea that he's really the king or who he is or that he's a big deal up in Thebes. So Oedipus continues on his way and makes his way to Thebes, but all hell is breaking loose in Thebes. You see, the Sphinx is there. The Sphinx is messing up everybody. Now, you guys have seen the statue of the Sphinx probably in Egypt or in Aladdin, possibly. The Sphinx was this mythological creature that would like wreak havoc on cities if you couldn't answer the riddle of the Sphinx. And the riddle of the Sphinx is what walks on 4 legs in the morning and 2 legs during the day and 3 legs in the evening. And if you could answer this riddle, the Sphinx would leave your town alone. But nobody in Thebes could answer this riddle until Oedipus strolled along. He was like, what? I'm smart. That's easy. What does he say? Man, yeah, because you crawl as a baby, and then you walk as an adult, and then eventually you have to cripple along on a cane at the end of your life. So Oedipus answers the Sphinx riddle. The Sphinx is like, what? Sphinx goes to like Egypt and is like frozen into a giant statue. And Oedipus is now like the man. Everybody in Thebes loves this guy. And it just so happens that everybody in Thebes needs a new king because the king just got killed on the road by some crazy dude and we don't know where he is. So, Oedipus, you want to be king? And Oedipus is like, sure. Like, I'm from a pretty meager background. My dad is really poor and everything, so I'll be king. Well, we got a bonus for you, Oedipus. You got this hot wife. She's a little older than you. She's a little older than you. She's the former queen of our old king. She's our former queen, but she can be yours now. And Oedipus is like, okay, a little out of my age range, but wow, you kind of look familiar. But whatever. And he's like, fine, let's marry. They get married. They have kids. Eventually, as always happens in these Greek tragedies, it's called a tragedy, as always happens in this Greek tragedy, there's this blind, wise dude that wanders in and he says, hey, Oedipus, I've got some news for you. And Oedipus is like, all right, what you got? He's like, guess what? Your parents, when you were a little kid, went to the oracle, and here's what the oracle told them, that you were going to kill your dad and marry your mom. Well, Oedipus is like, well, that's crazy, because my dad is like out in the farm or wherever he is. He's like, no, your dad is that guy you killed on the road. And Oedipus is like, oh boy. So my mom is next door? Like with my kids? With my mom? And this blind guy is like, yeah, that's what it is. And Oedipus is like, loses his mind. He takes a brooch out of his like toga or whatever, jabs out his eyeballs. So if you think we don't have connections to ancient societies or ancient people, would you feel, if you found out that news, would you probably feel like jabbing out your eyeballs? Probably. We haven't changed that much over time, right? He jabs out his eyeballs and he leaves town, he gets out of Dodge, and he just wanders the world aimlessly blind now for the rest of his existence. But hey, if you think that having a dad that killed your grandpa and married your grandma and mom is going to set up for a nice existence for you, you're wrong, and you're going to want to read the next 2 books in the trilogy.
All right, it doesn't work out for anybody in the family. So plays, this was a play by Sophocles, and people would go to the play and hear the story, and this is what often shapes these cultures. It's a cultural activity that everybody gets involved in. Everybody eventually knows the stories. They love them, much like you guys would go out to the movies and watch things like that. Fortunately for us, some of these things still remain, and so we can still read. Most of Sophocles' writings are gone. We don't have any clue of what they were. But a handful of them remain, and we can read them and tell creepy stories to kids. We also will look at Greek culture because of the architecture that they created, the monumental architecture that they create, that is still seen around the world today. These are known as Greek orders. Like, different times in Greek history are going to have different types of architecture or different styling in their architecture. And we see within these Greek orders a move from more basic column work, for example, to more ornate, to ultimately the most ornate. These orders are called Doric, and I think these are on your standards. Doric, the Doric order, very plain. The capital of the column is very basic. Ionic, the Ionic order, we see the scroll up at the top of the capital. And then the Corinthian, you see like fluting and very ornate at the top. All right. Obviously, these would be later, a later order. You guys can go to Washington D.C. or Lansing or state capital or any city and see buildings that are going to be employing these today. And also, as different societies have connections with the Greek world. For example, the Romans use a lot of columns within their architecture as well because of their connections with the Greek world. One final note to mention, as these societies move and evolve, ideas spread as well. And here we have a sculpture from ancient Greece presenting the human form. And here we have a sculpture from the Buddhist world in India. And we can see some connections between how the Buddhists in India and eventually in South Asia and Southeast Asia connect with the Greek world. Their art, their sculpture still has some differences, but starts to look very similar. And it can only start to look similar because guess what? People are going to be moving. Primarily merchants, but missionaries as well, are going to be moving from society to society, seeing different kinds and parts of the world. So we're going to see some link-ups between this Greco-Roman world and the Buddhist world, influencing sculpture, for example. And with that, we are done with our first standard of the year.